My name is GEMMA Mortensen. I'm the Executive Director of Crisis Action. And what we'd like to very much discuss with you today, we want to generate a good conversation this afternoon, is to look at some of the models that are using networks and using collaborative engagement to really power social change. And we're going to hear from some really interesting case studies today that are building organisations and partnerships in very different ways, but ultimately that value networking or collaboration is one of the inherently most valuable things in what enables them to produce social impact. So if you look through the Skoll World Forum agenda, it's very, very clear in terms of the issues that are covered, what are some of the world's most pressing problems. The Skoll World Forum, as we know, is here to help solve them. So the kind of things that are thrown up are how to educate the world, many of them very disenfranchised and rural communities, how to look at food security, how to look at climate change, how to look at sustainable fisheries, which we'll hear more about, how to end modern-day slavery. I mean, these are massive, massive, complex global problems. So I want to start with a bit of a thought experiment for you all. I want you to take one problem in the world, something that you yourself would call one of the most pressing global problems of our time, and I want you to just try and visualize it. I want you to try and visualize the amount of the world that it covers, the amount of people that it affects, the kind of systems that would be required to solve it. I just want you to try and get your head around just any one of those problems. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds in which to do that. Now I want you to have a think about you're a general of a very altruistic army, and you're able to call into being every man, woman, organisation, piece of resources that you want to go and fight this problem. So I want you to imagine that you're going through one of those excruciating experiences where you're picking your kind of football team or whatever, and I want you to literally visualise summoning up those individuals and organisations and resources that would be required for you to fight this. Now, how many of you summoned up a solitary man, a solitary woman, one government, one corporation, one grassroots organisation, one investment firm? How many of you summoned up a swarm of the same thing? 100 governments, 100 NGOs, 100 financiers. Interesting. Interesting. Okay, you either have a lot of faith in your own abilities or you haven't got many friends. And how many of you conjured up seas, a messy sea of lots of different kinds of people? People that came from very diverse backgrounds, actually. People that had very different missions in life. People that took many different shapes and sizes or organisations. I know I certainly did. Right. So I think we know instinctively that we need networks, we need collaborative models to drive the kind of change that we need to see to solve some of these problems. I think we know that instinctively. I think we know that these networks need to be very broad. I think we know that they need to be diverse. It's not just like recruiting people like us, it's recruiting people who don't think like us at all. And I think we know that they've got to be extremely well organised. Any of the people or organisations that you visualise just left to their own devices aren't going to have much of a stab at cracking some of these things. What we've got less good at, I think, or what we are less good at, is sharing our experiences and sharing learning about how to set up different kinds of collaborative models that are both effective and efficient. So the purpose of the conversation today is to do three things, really. The first is just to hear three different case studies. One of which is my own organisation, Crisis Action, which works behind the scenes to build big global coalitions to protect civilians in conflict situations, not an easy thing to do. One of which is from Nick, who's going to talk about two different models, actually, which were set up to look at ending the scourge of modern-day slavery. Again, not something you get out of bed in the morning and expect to solve in 24 hours. And then the Marine Stewardship Council, run by Rupert House here, which is looking at taking on making our commitment to fisheries sustainable and saving the stock of the ocean, which again is going to be absolutely critical to the survival of mankind. So we're talking about individuals and organisations that are really taking on some of the biggest things. And within this audience, I know, just looking at a few familiar faces, we've got other individuals who've set up similarly innovative and incredible networks or collaborative models that I'm also going to draw upon in terms of the conversation. So we're going to hear about those case studies, and what we're going to try and tap is a few simple questions, and we'd really like anyone in the audience to really get involved in this after we've heard those. So the first is just to get a real handle on what are the problems that these things have been set up to try and solve, and why is some manner of network building or collaboration seen as an absolutely integral part of this model, of this intended solution to a particular problem. We want to know what the magic ingredients are. So if any of you were to kind of go out there and replicate it tomorrow, what is our thinking about what actually really does make it work? What could you strip everything away has to be there to make it functional? And then finally, what are the challenges? Like, let's be honest, this is a huge task, and I don't think any of us have cracked it perfectly. So what are the things that would enable us what are the ways in which we can share those challenges to hopefully get better at it? And I count myself in that learning journey. So I'm going to start off with Nick in terms of his case study, and I'm going to come back to my own. And then we're going to open it up to some conversations and just to hear from some of your individual experiences, as well as getting questions after that.
Well, thanks, Gemma. And look, I'm delighted to be at Skoll World Forum. I really can't think of a better event to talk about networks and collaboration. I mean, it's just a rich opportunity to build informal networks and opportunities to collaborate. I'm going to talk about my experiences over the last decade working in NGOs and the kind of the opportunities for building networks and collaboration there, and a lot of the challenges, because I think in this space, you know, there's a truism that networks and collaboration are like motherhood. You know, and the concept is wonderful, everyone supports it, but of course the practice is much harder than the theory. And I also find in this space that everyone thinks that there should be more coordination and more collaboration, but when it comes to the kind of the sharp end of collaborating and coordinating, people are very reluctant to be coordinated, because more often than not people think that their way is the best way of doing it, and it's getting over those obstacles that I think we have to confront to build much more effective networks and collaboration. Now, over the last decade I've been fortunate to work in leadership positions in 4 NGOs of one kind or another. Been very closely involved with Crisis Action as on the board there for the last 7 years. And I think Crisis Action, and we'll hear about it, but let me kind of steal some of Gemma's thunder. I think it's one of the most kind of impactful network building organisations out there, and I think its model is tremendously effective, and we can all benefit from learning more about how that works. I spent 9 years at International Crisis Group, which is a very effective research and advocacy organisation focused on deadly conflict around the world. I think had a very impressive model, but was not very good at networking or working with others and collaborating. And there are reasons for this. You know, ICG focused very much on field-based political analysis, very nuanced, very sophisticated, very detailed, which didn't lend itself necessarily to a collaborative effort. And then it focused on elite-level advocacy based on its own analysis and and again, kind of took the view that, you know, it was best placed to focus on the advocacy of its messages to senior policymakers. While I was at ICG, we did try a formal kind of collaborative effort. We set up an organisation called the Enough Campaign in partnership with Centre for American Progress, which was focused much more on grassroots advocacy around on campaigns against mass atrocities and genocide. And it really didn't work very well for International Crisis Group, because we found there was a whole mixed messaging going on, and you had to have a very simple, very straightforward message if you wanted a mass mobilisation that was utterly contrary to a much more nuanced message at International Crisis Group that we were trying to get across. So we parted ways. Then I went and worked for Walk Free, which is a newish NGO set up in Australia about 18 months ago by a billionaire philanthropist there with the mission of ending modern slavery. And one of the key strategies of Walk Free is to build a mass online movement to raise awareness and drive action on slavery. And we were very successful in building a movement. You know, in terms of raw numbers, in the space of 18 months, we established an online movement of about 6 million people. Now, that movement, you have to take it for what it is, very thin. People who have signed up through Facebook and email, and you have to understand the value and the impact that you can have and how best to deploy it. But I think, you know, in terms of the objective we were setting ourselves of raising awareness and building a constituency, that was a relatively successful model. Very top-down, very controlled, and I think over time probably not sustainable in that form. But in fact, our objective over the next 2 years is to shift the leadership of that top-down model to the movement itself. And I think the success of that movement will depend on whether or not we can successfully achieve that. And then about 3 months ago, I became CEO of something called the Freedom Fund, founded by 3 very big philanthropists in the space, in the anti-slavery space, one of them being Walk Free, and the other being Humanity United, another being Legatum. And this is a different model of collaboration, and a very interesting one, of course, which is 3 big funders, all very active in the anti-slavery space, deciding to pool their resources as a way of more effectively achieving their objectives. And it presents all sorts of challenges. I mean, these organisations have quite different philosophies, and they have, different priorities, different areas of focus, and it's been very, very interesting to watch how they have worked together very successfully, I would say, to build an organisation with a very clear focus and with an objective of bringing others in by demonstrating success in the space. So, there are 4 examples of NGOs that work in a collaborative space. I pulled out a few quick lessons, and I put these out there with the hope of stimulating some discussion. And the lessons, I think, are all pretty obvious, but it's the challenges that I think we should be focusing on. The benefits I've identified in my experience of working with networks and collaborations is that, if it's done properly, you get an alignment of forces, you can get a multiplication of voices and actions, you have an ability to use your different strengths and audiences to drive a clear ask at multiple levels. And this is particularly important with a global campaign where, your messaging in the north and the south may well be very different in different regions, different audiences. It's an effective way to build mass participation, as GEMMA illustrated so effectively just now. And of course, you can make it more politically palatable for political actors in particular to accept your ask when you have a mass movement that is asking for something. So those are some of the benefits, but there are a lot of obstacles, and I think when it comes to networks, we'll all agree pretty much on the strength of the concept. So it's incumbent on us to look at the obstacles, because if it is such a wonderful concept and we all think it's a way of driving change, well then why aren't we doing it better, and why aren't more people doing it more effectively? And I think one of the real challenges with networks and with collaboration is there's a real tendency to accept a lowest common denominator as a means of building agreement. Right? If you've got a lot of parties, lots of different views, in the end, the easiest way to get agreement is often to settle for something that everyone can agree on, which is often not going to be very targeted, not going to be very focused, and maybe not pushing in a direction sufficiently that you want to achieve. There can be huge transaction costs. Just think of all the time you spend in meetings trying to get agreement around your strategy, your branding, your asks, over what you're going to do it and how you're going to do it. I certainly know that through working in networks and working in collaborative, there is a huge investment there, and I think it's incumbent on us to think, is there value? Is there sufficient benefit from doing this? Which is why it's so important to get it right, because it's even more frustrating if you invest all this effort and of course you don't have a productive outcome. And I think we can learn a lot here from the crisis action model. Individual incentives of organisations can be aligned against cooperation. Right? Organisations are often in competition with each other for profile, for funding, for kind of an ability to drive and claim credit for driving change in a particular space. And that can be really challenging. So finding ways that you can get over those incentives. And of course, networks can often play to NGO weaknesses. NGOs are very good and very keen to reach agreement, to be consultative, to be, to act in accord, not to avoid conflict. But when you are trying to drive a clear political campaign and have some real focus about what you're doing, that's not always conducive to achieving that outcome. So for me, I think, I'll finish up with 3 or 4 quick lessons. And again, all pretty obvious, but planning is key, and a heavy investment in planning and putting the issues on the table. You're not going to avoid the issues by not discussing them. And so, all the parties need to be willing to put out on the table what their particular approaches are, what they want to achieve, how they think they should be achieved, so that those can be thrashed out. And the more of that planning that is done in advance, the more chance to succeed in your mission. I know with the Freedom Fund, We spent over 6 months of the 3 founder organisations and endless meetings of putting all of the issues about what they wanted to achieve, what the structure was, endless meetings talking about the Articles of Association of the Freedom Fund, so that it was all down there, got a memorandum of agreement in advance, reflected in the Articles of Association. And to my mind, having put all those issues on the table, it's been much, much easier than I expected to advance the mission of this organisation with 3 different partners and founders. Except that there's no one model that fits all. I mean, this is the real challenge as you start putting together a network and a model. There isn't. Crisis Action has a particular model. It's suited to a particular type of campaigning. You know, you have big mass movements like Jubilee 2000 or the campaign to ban landmines. You know, there are different lessons from all of those, and it's the model should be driven by your understanding of what you want to achieve and how you think you can best achieve it, not a kind of, well, this worked in this particular campaign and therefore we'll replicate it here. If you have a single issue that you're pushing, a big ask, you know, the clearer and simpler the ask, the easier it is to build a movement around it. Calling for a treaty, right? Nice, big, simple, clear ask is probably one of the easiest, and I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying one of the easiest asks in terms of big mass mobilisation campaign. It's a nice, clear win if you can achieve it and you can push and you can pressure. You know, the more complex your message, the more complex your ask, the more challenging it is to drive it forward. So understand that when you're building your network. And just understand what model works best for you. You know, if you have a targeted and complex campaign, then a smaller network that kind of takes a higher position and surrenders some of the breadth of movement may be more effective. If you've got the resources, you can build a top-down movement, but understand what makes it sustainable. So I think, you know, let me finish up there. I won't leave you with any clear answers, but what I will say is that if you're approaching the issue of building networks and challenges, you need to have a clear-headed analysis of the obstacles and what you want to achieve. You need to understand what are the best methods to do so. You need to invest very, very heavily in planning, and you need to have a clear-eyed understanding of the incentives and the organisational imperatives. Thank you.
Okay, my name's Rupert House, Chief Executive of the Marine Stewardship Council. I'm a last-minute addition to this panel, and I'm having one of those opportunistic days. This morning, the Social Entrepreneurs, Skoll Social Entrepreneurs, had a closed session with the Executive Director from TED, and he was giving this masterclass on how you make an effective TED presentation. And then he said, who wants to come up and do a 3-minute talk? And I foolishly found myself waving. And I went forward and I thought, well, I could love to do this one day. And similarly, I thought I'd join this panel last minute and just give it a go. And GEMMA asked me to talk about the problem, you know, the model of the MSC and the success factors, and then obviously touch on some of the challenges. And what I learned from my TED attempt this morning was to have a prop. And so this is my prop. It's a fish, okay? Just picture this as a seafood. It's a crab, a cod, salmon. How many people in this room eat something like this every week? Okay, almost everybody. More than once a week? Okay. So it is not surprising, touching on the problem, that our oceans are in trouble. Production of seafood over the last 50 years has gone up 5-fold. We're taking out about 100 million metric tons of seafood every year from the oceans. Seafood makes up about 20% of global human protein, animal protein needs, and for about 1 billion people on this planet, it is actually the main source of animal protein. So the plight of our ocean fisheries is perhaps one of the biggest sustainability challenges humanity faces after climate change. Social impacts and environmental impacts, 200 million people working in this industry, the last global industry harvesting a wild resource for food. It's one of the most traded primary commodities in the world, with 50% of that coming from the developing world. So in a way, just from the hands up in this room, it's something that connects all of us. It's food, it's livelihoods, it's economic trade, and it's oceans. A plethora of wider marine ecosystem impacts from overfishing and poor fishing practice. So briefly, you know, MSC, our model, we are the world's leading certification and labeling program. We were founded following the collapse of the Grand Banks cod fishery off the eastern US seaboard. This was a fishery that Basque fishermen had been fishing to feed Europe during the Middle Ages. Literally thousands of tons of cod for centuries were caught from this fishery. And as we moved from sail to steam to diesel, technology got better at catching, finding and killing fish. this fishery eventually collapsed. And that was the big wake-up call for industry to say, my God, if we don't manage these oceans sustainably, we won't have a resource upon which our business is based. No cheap, plentiful supplies of frozen white fish, no fish sticks, no Captain Birdseye, no Captain Igloo. Enlightened self-interest. We must manage this stock sustainably. So that's the industry partner. WWF, our other founder, so Unilever was one founder, WWF, the world's largest international conservation organization, was our other founder. And they came together with Unilever in '97 because I think they were frustrated at the traditional approaches to public policy reform to really deliver change on the water. So the idea was to create a market-based program, something that would work with the grain of the industry and use a third-party evidence, science-based certification and labeling program to reward existing good practice, because it's not all doom and gloom out there. There are some very, very well-managed fisheries out there in the oceans. But critically, and this is where the multi-sector model comes in, by working with civil society, by working with the market players and with the industry themselves, can that collective group of stakeholders contribute to creating a global market that increasingly demands only certified, sustainable, and fully traceable seafood choices? So the theory of change is incredibly simple. Get the market to say we care where our seafood comes from, we're not going to buy it if we can't get assurance that it is from a well-managed stock, and you put supply chain pressure of the best possible kind all the way back down those supply chains on a global basis because it's so highly traded. And that incentivizes fisheries where they need to improve the way they fish the oceans. So we were founded by industry and conservation organizations. We became fully independent in '97. And that sort of multi-sector sort of stakeholder approach is sort of ingrained into all aspects of the organization. A snapshot, now we're an organization of about 140 people operating from 15 countries around the world. And as chief exec, I report to a board made up of leading fishery scientists, leading people from the seafood industry, from retailers and from processors, leaders from the harvest sector, but also, again, from civil society. That is hardwired into our memorandum and articles. So we have that balance within our main governance body, the board. We have a stakeholder council made up of 40 representatives globally, again, from those specific groups, with a subgroup from the developing world to help guide the board in terms of the much tougher issues of accessibility and access to developing world fisheries. And we also have a technical advisory board, so a huge amount of governance. And then also within the process itself, we are the standard setter. The standard at the highest level looks at the stock health, the wider environmental impacts, and the quality of the management regime. But we don't certify anything. The certifications are done by independent certification bodies who are independently accredited. They bring forward independent scientists. Very transparently, stakeholders can comment on those scientists and say, well, we're not too happy about her or him. You know, we think you should have somebody else. All of the evidence they use has to be publicly available. The fishery is scored, a separate set of scientists peer review what the first lot have done, and even then there's an independent objections process for people who might disagree with the outcome of the assessment. And even then, no product can carry the label unless there's full traceability throughout the supply chain. So ingrained into everything we do is the need to work with all sectors, and that's where the credibility comes from. It took 2 years to develop the standard, and then MSC became a fully independent organization. I think the market has become increasingly accepting of MSC because of that governance and because of that integration and transparency in absolutely everything we do. So we've got to the point now, after 15 years of independence, that we actually have 10% or so of the global harvest in the program. So about 10 million metric tons of seafood landed annually is certified or under assessment. And on the labelled product side, because I should have said this, our theory of change is premised on bringing those fisheries in, but then using a consumer-facing eco-label to educate all of us about, you know, you look for that fish stick and you've got that third-party assurance that it's well-managed, it's seafood from a well-managed stock. We have about 25,000 labelled products in a market worth $3 billion in 107 countries around the world. So to try and answer some of the questions, I mean, you know, we're going to scale. We're by no means there yet. I mean, there's a whole heap of challenges, but I think the success factors, and Nick touched on a lot of these, it's a clear vision and mission. We want the oceans to be fished sustainably to ensure there's seafood for this and future generations. I mean, that is crystal clear, and who in their right mind wouldn't say that's a good idea? We think we should support that. And then equally, the mission is very clear. We are going to use our third-party certification and labelling program to reward and incentivize, and through consumer power, encourage behavioral change to ensure fisheries improve the way they fish the oceans where needed. Very, very clear. And then the credibility and support is underpinned by the sort of multi-stakeholder model that we've adopted globally. And I think that's another, sort of core lesson for MSC, at least with our model, is it's scalable and it's replicable. Different markets admittedly have different receptivity to a labelling message, and that's maybe a challenge I can come to if I have time. But in essence, we started in Northern Europe where there was much more receptivity to labels. If you go to Germany, 50% of all wild-caught seafood carries the MSC label. Actually, I should have done a straw poll. Who's seen the MSC label? Okay, not bad, not bad. For an organisation with very limited marketing, sort of advertising funds, that's not too bad. We have aspirations to see global fisheries meeting a rigorous science-based standard. It doesn't have to be MSC, but it's got to be credible and robust. Moving to challenges, I mentioned half of all seafood that's traded comes from the developing world. These are often smaller scale fisheries. They don't have the sophisticated data sets that are needed for an MSC assessment. So we're now actively looking at how we can improve and develop new tools and methodologies to enable these fisheries to have access to the program. We've got about 20 or 30 of those fisheries engaged at some stage of the assessment process in India, in Africa, and in parts of Asia and Latin America. But I feel very strongly that we can actually develop new tools to actually enable us to get perhaps 25% of global fisheries in the program. And at that point, I think the market acceptance would almost be unstoppable. Do you want me to talk a little bit more about challenges or problems, or is that? Yeah, I think we can come to that. I mean, actually, one thing. We've had a clear run up to now, and we've proven the concept. We've got a growing evidence base of impacts, real changes that fisheries are making, reduced bycatch of birds, voluntary closures of the oceans, more stable biomass within MSC certified fisheries. And that's tremendous. And I think one of the challenges we face now is that there are other schemes developing, other assurance schemes, some sadly with very, very low bars, some simply endorsing existing best practice. And I think, following the 2008 crash and sort of continued economic turmoil, there is a real temptation for businesses to perhaps say, consumers are waking up to this issue, they need some sort of assurance, but MSC is quite a rigorous science-based standard. Perhaps we can go down here and sort of have some other sort of mechanism of providing that assurance. That is very dangerous if we're going to collectively deliver this vision. And it's a risk that other certification labelling programs also face. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Go for Ted. I don't need 2 mics. It's getting greedy. Thank you very much. Log down any questions you've got for either Nick or Rupert, and we'll come back to those. I just want to end by wrapping up with a few thoughts from Crisis Action, and to begin that with telling you a bit of a story. You all know that the conflict in Syria is raging on. You'll all know about it to different degrees of detail, but hopefully most of you have some sense that this is probably the most serious conflict of our times. We work very closely with individuals who have run various bits of the UN, run various governments, and almost all of them who've been to see the biggest crises, the biggest conflicts in their lifetime have told us this is worse than anything they've ever seen before. Now, Crisis Action was set up to do a very audacious thing. We asked ourselves the question of how do you get governments to listen to people who have no formal power over them. In conflict situations, the people who are affected by conflict are the most vulnerable, the poorest, the most dispossessed. They do not have any formal power over governments or decision makers who at that time are motivated by very vested interests, some of them economic, some of them political. And so how do you turn that kind of power dynamic on its head? And it was very, very clear to us that no one person, no one organisation, whether you're Amnesty International with hundreds of members and offices around the world, it doesn't matter how big you are, no one can do that alone. So the question was posed, how do you set up a coordinating body that can do one of several things? And this is something that both Nick and Rupert have touched upon. How do you get people who don't actually like each other very much to work with each other well? How do you get people whose interests aren't actually very aligned to see that there's win-wins and there's a joint strategy that they could follow where they both get something out of it? How do you make a mixture of something that is both planned and military enough so that the risk of things going off course is small, but spontaneous and anarchic enough to allow entrepreneurial solutions to evolve through those kind of networks? And how do you enable people kind of to adopt them? So to tell you the story and then to come to the solutions that I think the model is kind of based on that we came to. A year ago, several of us, including people on my board, sat down and we racked our brains, and we were very depressed about the situation in Syria, I won't lie to you. And we felt actually pretty that our efficacy was limited, that we were really obstructed by just the hard politics around this conflict. And we looked at the general public, and most people, if I do a poll of my mum and my grandma and the people that are my taxi driver, that kind of thing, I kept on hearing the same things. There's no good guys, there's no solution. Frankly, it's not our mess, like leave it alone. And I really felt, okay, it's the kind of line of work I'm in, but could I face my kids? Could I face my grandkids? And for them to know the history of this conflict and feel that I hadn't done everything possible, that we hadn't done everything possible as a community to respond to this in the right way. So we literally went through the thought exercise that you did at the beginning, and we thought, who would we need as part of our army? If we're building this kind of football team to go and kind of try and convince people that might be able to do something to help innocent civilians in Syria, who would it need to contain? And we came to the following conclusions. Well, it's got to contain some of the NGOs that are on the ground. They're doing amazing work, they're delivering humanitarian assistance. They've got to be part of the solution. It's got to involve a lot of political decision makers, and they can't just be our friends. It can't just be the Americans and the Europeans. It's got to be the Iranians and the Saudis and the Russians and people that we may not know so well. We've got to have people involved who can inspire a sense of moral responsibility, who can invoke in people the fact that this is not just another conflict that we can all ignore. This is something that is momentous in our era. And so that's faith leaders, that might be business leaders, that's people who are able to speak to a certain sector of humanity and inspire them to get engaged. And so what happened was, over a period of time and through much great advice, up into the running of this year, we amassed that dream team. So ahead of the World Economic Forum in Davos, we got all the CEOs of all the major humanitarian and human rights organisations to come together and agree that they would meet with foreign ministers and heads of state from all those countries that I mentioned, and drop what are often very, 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 very important but individual organisational priorities and focus on one clear thing. There are certain red lines that can't be crossed here. However bad the situation is, and for sure there are bad guys on all sides, there are innocent people who are not getting humanitarian assistance. There are doctors who are being mown down just because they're trying to treat kids. There are teachers who are being bombed in schools where they're trying to rescue some semblance of education for the kids that are going to school. That's not okay, and we've got to prove that that's not okay. And they went into meetings with the Iranians and the Russians and the Saudis and the Americans and the Brits and the French and everyone else, and they absolutely articulated to them that this is a moment where we're standing strong together. And it was incredible to see the dynamic that had in terms of that level of consensus and coherence. Coming out of that experience, we then decided that there was a real moment around the Sochi Olympics where the Russians were particularly, let's say, contemplative of their public image. This is pre-Ukraine. It would have been a very different calculation if Ukraine had already fired up. And so a group of former foreign ministers and heads of state, about 40 of them, came together and they wrote an open letter to President Putin. They appealed to him. They said, President Putin, the most incredible spectacle is about to unfold in Sochi, and we're going to see feats of, Olympian effort, which will dazzle us all. But that's nothing compared to what's going on in terms of the battle that ordinary people are fighting just to get through daily life, to get their kids through school, to get medical assistance for people who've been hurt, like create a legacy for the Olympics. Now, this was a hard, bitter pill for some people to swallow who'd been in public office and frankly hadn't necessarily had the funnest of times engaging with the Russians over the years, but they saw that there was a moment here around Sochi to do something that could create political capital for a Russian government whilst getting something for the people of Syria. And what they asked the Russians to do was to enable the passage of a UN Security Council resolution that made clear for the first time that there could be no disagreement about the need to get aid into Syria, across borders, into the besieged communities that had basically were being starved out. Now, the Security Council had been deadlocked for 3 years, and this worked. A combination of the same organisations that had met the foreign ministers, etc., in Davos, had lobbied governments around the world with the same messages for months on end, and this high-level network, mobilised at the right moment, really helped to cut through. We heard from decision makers that this was, a very, very helpful intervention. Now, that's part of a kind of step change, but that's nothing. Again, what we were then hearing from the governments was, well, that's great, but we're not hearing anything from our publics. Our publics don't care about this. And even the people with the best intentions, without the wind in their sails to do something about it, without a public mandate to act, there's very little that they can do. Their hands are tied. And so in a way that Nick was speaking about, actually, then engaging with some of the best organisations who are good at building global movements and getting, artists involved, like the graffiti artist Banksy that many of you have heard about, to kind of do a whole new image, a whole new guerrilla kind of image for the people of Syria, and to release that as part of a mass mobilisation campaign around the world, which reached 250 million people in over 115 countries, but so many people got involved that it was a real expression to politicians who had themselves felt deflated, just as we had a year ago, that no, there's wind back in the sails, there's a desire for you to do something, there's a desire to keep investing, however hard the political situation, and trust me, it had become very hard as Ukraine now had really broken out. We still want you to keep your skin in the game. So all of these people didn't do any of that just because they felt like it. That's incredibly orchestrated effort, and just to take the kind of veil off what some of that orchestration looked like, because I think that's what we've learned about some lessons about collaboration. We certainly haven't got all the answers. The first is to take ego out of it. Now, a lot of people laugh at me and my organisation when we say this, because there are many people in my organisation, and I'll remain ambiguous on myself, you can make up your own mind, who have enormous egos. So it's not that the people in your organisation can't have egos, they can, they should. Have big lusty egos that want to kind of go out and change the world, that's great. But the organisation per se does not have an ego. So we work completely behind the scenes. Hopefully none of you will have heard of us, apart from the ones that know us already. And that's deliberate. We're not allowed to do any media coverage, ever. We're never allowed to get interviewed by a journalist. If we do, we're kind of like shot dead on the spot. We're not allowed to fundraise from the public. We can't create a public brand. And that's to enable the partners that we work with to believe it when we say to them, we're in this to create collective impact. That's our job. Your win is our win. Like, you've got to trust us as a mediator. The second of all, which touches to Nick's point, is don't get bedeviled by consensus. We have this thing called an opt-in model. And I think it would be much more difficult to do in Rupert's situation, because, as you say, your credibility is so linked to a very kind of locked-in governance model that provides that. But the way in which we work, because we're trying to challenge established power as much as to embrace it, I think, is to say, you're with us or without us. We're like, my colleague here, Nicola, who runs our campaigns, came up with something which I think is a very, very brilliant saying, which is listen and lead. So we go out there and we say, we're not the experts. We're going to go and speak to anybody in the world who can help us solve this problem, and particularly the partners that we work with who are absolutely fantastic. We're going to listen to you, and we're going to ask you, what's the best way to solve this problem, and how can we do this together? What would be your blueprint to enable us to do that? And then we're going to lead. Then we're going to make a call. We're not going to stay passive and wait for everyone to agree. We're going to decide what is going to be the best way of bringing an effective outcome about for us all to work collectively. So it's up to people to opt into that. Once you've articulated what you think is the way forward, you're not binding anyone to a marriage forever. You're saying, like, come and do this. And hopefully that's a way in which you retain kind of hearts and minds and a bit of skin in the game. I think the other last thing is those win-wins. We try and think, and with our partners as well, for all those individuals that I described who are involved in that effort, we started off, before we even approached them to ask them to do something, to ask ourselves, what's in it for them? For politicians, there has to be some political capital that comes out of it. There has to be a reward, like think about celebrating and rewarding them. For organisations that do have a public profile, it's really important they do get a media kick out of any kind of collective effort. for faith leaders or former foreign ministers who have very generously donated their time and their name and the weight of their position to an effort that you're deploying. Again, think about what's in it for them. Sometimes it's just a thanks. Sometimes it's being part of something that reinvigorates their own sense of agency. Sometimes it's very important who their peers are in terms of the company that they're seen in. And so being really, really mindful of actually the inherent human motivation that enables people to become part of collective efforts and gives them that sense of satisfaction that is partly geared by the greater good and by the goal that you're trying to go for, but partly actually comes down to much more mundane sentiments, that it's really, really important and just pragmatic to kind of satisfy in people. So those are some of the lessons from Crisis Action, and I think it's a model which bits of it are definitely applicable in other sectors. We've seen some of it being adapted and adopted, and I'm just very personally convinced that everything that we're seeing, the technologies that are being put at our disposal increasingly are allowing us to create hybrid organisations now, and I think we're almost old-fashioned now. Hybrid organisations that do two things: they tap the ability to organise and to make collaboration easy, to take away some of those transaction costs that Nick talked about, but they also create the opportunity to kickstart something which is spontaneous and magical, and this weird kind of alchemy of people deciding that they're going to seed things themselves. And that's where I think the next new frontier is. It's an organisation who can capture the strength and rigour of kind of some of the top-down organisation and strategic partnerships, with the beauty of seeing people tap into something because it's just got them somewhere in the guts, and to take it and replicate it for themselves, and to do that in a way that keeps channeling change towards the direction that you want it. So that's a couple of reflections from my own experience. What I'd love to do now is call on a couple of people in the audience that I know are there and I've seen, who I think also have some really interesting reflections, and then open it up to questions and, more importantly, comments. I think so many of us at the Skoll World Forum are working already in collaborative and network ways, and we want to hear from you. What do you think are the key ingredients for success? And looking forward, what are we going to look like? What are going to be the most innovative models in the next 10, 20 years that enable us to kind of crack these big, complex issues even better? So I'm pointing to a friend of mine at the back, Mr. Leaf, call him here, who runs something called the Freedom Project at CNN, which is, I think, again, very, very innovative. And we have a huge international broadcaster that decided to partner up for a cause. And Leaf, maybe you can tell us a bit about that and then just focus down on what few are the key successes and where we're going.
Okay. I should start off by saying I'm a bit of a reluctant or accidental activist. Actually, that's the first time I've ever referred to myself as such. So I guess I'm in the company of friends who support that. But my background is in journalism and documentary filmmaking. And in 2010, I did a documentary. I'd been primarily focused on environment issues and global warming, but I did a documentary. It was actually a side documentary. I was doing something on Angkor Wat and how the Khmer Empire fell as part of climate change in the 14th century. I ended up doing a side project where we were doing an investigation for a film called World's Untold Stories, and we were looking at the issue of child prostitution in Phnom Penh, and we went into one of these like bar, brothel, hotel, casinos that they have there. It was called the Paris Hotel, and we had our little undercover cameras, and found a 12-year-old girl and took her up to the room, and she solicited us, and we had that evidence on camera. We took it to the Phnom Penh Police Department, and we said, okay, thank you. We'll look at this, and then we'll conduct a raid on Friday. So we showed up on Friday with our cameras, and we're ready to go. And they said, oh well, we had gone over there last night. We checked her papers. She's fine. She's 19. Everything's okay. And we knew that was she was on camera telling us she was 12 years old. She looked about 9, and so we we knew that there was some sort of collusion. First of all, why would you go the night before to announce yourself and look at our papers? But it turned out a year later, after we launched the Freedom Project, that the chief of the human trafficking unit in Phnom Penh was convicted of corruption. It was the first ever conviction. As part of the story, we kind of stayed on it. But when I took that story back to CNN and showed some of the executives, some of my bosses, the material we got and the kind of pain that came out of having to leave that little girl behind, just leave the country. Everybody was very upset and outraged. In fact, it was when I showed them that you could go onto TripAdvisor and type in the Paris Hotel, which was the name of this bar, hotel, casino. They would talk about how, you know, the room is it's a nice clean room, very affordable, a little bit far away from the main center. The air conditioning is kind of noisy, and if you're with your family, you should avoid the 5th, 6th, and 7th floors because those are operating fishbowl brothels, which of course Cambodia it's illegal. Prostitution's illegal in any form there. But everybody was outraged and wanted to know why this was going on and why, you know, this was the first we were hearing about it. So you know, I made the suggestion that we could do this, you know, every month. My background was filmmaking, so I was thinking in terms of half-hour specials. But the boss at CNN said that this is, you know, something much bigger. He was really, really angry about it and decided to get the whole network involved. So they gave me about 6 months to come up with an idea of what the Freedom Project would look like. At first I called it Enslaved, but my boss said that, you know, people would kick their foot through the TV screen if they had to sit and watch, you know, multiple stories on human trafficking that just presented these kind of dire situations and consequences. So we changed it to a more solutions-oriented approach, which was the CNN Freedom Project. And it's funny because the title of this is network building, and you know, how do you gain large-scale partnerships and get different parties together? And I had no idea the kind of boiling pot I was jumping into when I got involved in the NGO space. I thought everybody's trying to stop slavery, and yeah. So I was like, hey, do you know this person? They're like, we don't like that person. They're not they're not good people. And I was like, okay. So what we've done, and then the other thing, you know, as journalists, we want to maintain neutrality and objectivity. Those are kind of the credos of journalism. And so, how do you take on an issue? How do you push for change while maintaining neutrality? It's kind of a tough little paradox to solve. So, what we did. Well, that's what we don't do is have partnerships. That's how we get around this. We don't have any organizations that we tie ourselves to or have any formal relationships with. That said, we work with everybody. We're kind of approach agnostic. So I think we've worked with 135 NGOs and governments across, I think it's 67 countries where we've done stories, all 5 continents, or I guess there's more than 5 continents, but we need to get to Australia, actually. You know, we've had a lot of success. I think our approach is based on, kind of similar to what Crisis Action Network does, is it's focused on the issue. Everybody at a baseline wants to stop slavery, and you can kind of come in, come out, work with us on an issue if it, you know, particularly lends itself to the work that you're doing as an organization. And if it's a topic or it's an industry, we take on all the different forms of slavery. So if it's you know, child prostitution or forced labor or bonded labor or child soldiering, we work with different organizations that are specifically looking at those issues. So
it's very much setting up a non-partnership towards a particular end on a particular issue around a particular time bound. So it's all about, it's actually for you, it's all about being finite. It's all about having specific objectives.
Well, it's almost I wouldn't say it's finite. I think it's just it's kind of very casual in the sense, like we did a documentary with Cecil Obanda from the Visayan Forum down there in the Philippines. Yeah. And you know, we ended up working very closely together. I spent 2 years going back and forth from Atlanta to Manila to tell her story. But after that, first of all, once the story airs, or is in the run up to airing, we get all our friends from all the other stories that we've done. So it ends up being a fairly large consensus moving towards a topic, because they know that CNN has helped them in the past. They want to return the favor. They know that there's different organizations working. So
strong reciprocity, actually, because you've got something to offer both people who engage with you, but then people who have engaged. I mean, you've got direct win-wins that serve you as a channel, as a broadcaster, but also all the people that you collaborate with.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think what we try to do is just foster goodwill within the community, and we don't have silos. We don't have certain groups that won't work with us because they know we're working with everybody. Yeah. So I don't know that it's a model that necessarily could be replicated just because it's a one of a kind. Yeah, I mean, it's CNN, it's journalism, and we're not necessarily in the fight. One of the things that we were very clear on is we're not doing anything, really. All we're doing is telling the stories of the people who are risking their lives on the ground. And so we were just trying to gain attention to their plights and to the plights of the victims as they try to battle this. Okay, let's open it up to some questions or comments. And to those of you who have experiences of building collaborative models yourselves, please do come in. Because I think it doesn't have to be anything related to what we've talked about in terms of the issues, but I think there's lots to learn from this audience about how you strike up partnerships with people where there's not a natural alignment to start with, and where there does have to be some tricky choreography and sophisticated mind melding to make it work. Yes?
I've got a question, actually, out there to everyone. I'm from Australia. I work for a funder who's interested in changing the conversation in Australia around refugees. We've got a government that's, shall we say, very focused on security rather than protection and human rights, and effectively outsourcing our human rights obligations. There's a deal that's been brokered, is in the process of being brokered, in which people seeking asylum in Australia will be sent to Cambodia. So that's, this is what we're interested in kind of working on. I'm wondering if anyone's had any experience with this kind of, particularly actually around not preaching to the converted. There's this solid core of people in Australia who are opposed to what's happening. How do we, move beyond that and talk to
So how to engage a government against what is actually its majority popular constituency on something?
How to neutralise it as an issue? It's currently a hot potato, in Australia, and how to just make it a non-issue for those people, in marginal electorates and people who just think that people are illegal and
Okay, great, thanks. I'm going to turn to our resident Australian, who's actually in your pre-NGO history worked for the government. So maybe you can shed some light on that in terms of any advice from your experience.
I mean, I'm trying to think of it more in terms of a networked approach, because the discourse in Australia is one where there is popular support to close Australia's borders, and it's not that different from the argument I'm hearing in England right now, which is perhaps not surprising given that the political advisor to the UK Prime Minister is the same political advisor to the former Conservative government that has identified that there is popular concern about an issue that can be whipped up. And there's no short answer. I think about it. I mean, what struck me is just recently listening to the IPCC report on climate change, and and this kind of discourse about huge negative climate impact that is heading our way, and yet the challenges of mobilising mass popular concern about it, and listening to some expert, on presenting public issues that were talking, and maybe this is a simplistic approach, but for someone who doesn't have, like myself, who doesn't have much understanding of these issues, how to change a positive message about encouraging towards a goal that we can all work towards. And the stuff that GEMMA was talking about, how do we mobilise a constituency on Syria that just kind of thinks, well, it's awful, but it won't change and we can't do anything about it. And in Australia, I think there's a real problem of the kind of the elites on this issue, and very well-meaning, talking to their own constituencies and not willing to perhaps change their message to someone, not willing to accept that there is a fear, legitimate or not, right? I mean, it's there. And unless one can start tackling that and building constituencies that aren't the Greens, the left, the anti-refugee communities, the same old figures who do wonderful work, but it's not working. And it may not be possible to work. I mean, there is a real challenge, right? How can you mobilise enough constituencies who care enough about an issue to bring it on? I don't know. I suspect, as I'm learning in a lot of this, storytelling is really, really important, connecting the individual. And this is where Leaf, I'm sure, is, can teach all of us about how do you make someone care about this one particular issue, not, refugee policy writ large, but the individual who has escaped from unbearable suffering in Afghanistan, who has no world to return to. And those stories aren't getting told or registering effectively enough, but building that constituency to do that is a real challenge.
Great, thanks. Celia, you've got this.
Well, I think the learnings that I have when it comes to the relationship with the CNN, maybe CNN don't have really any partners or don't want to partner with anybody like local organizations like us. But I think as a social entrepreneur, you need really to capture that opportunity in order also to mobilize network for social change in specific issues in specific countries. Like, for example, what happened to us after the CNN, we have conviction. The girls that were rescued in the boat that he covered, actually, we have a conviction of the trafficker who we actually apprehended. And that conviction is not, it's not of course, well, partly because of the exposure of the CNN, but it creates a lot of, anger. It creates a lot of clamor, not only from the NGO, but also from the government. So it somehow provides a platform also in creating networks, And as of now, I would happy to say that after the documentary, even the Department of Justice, they created program for sex pornography. They also create and there is an increased crackdowns, crackdowns of pornography sites, of sex trafficking, cyber sex trafficking, because it is an opportunity that opened and the government itself was challenged. What I'm saying here is that maybe we started the relationship without, it's just really a subject of a journalistic relationship, but I think it can always facilitate a more large-scale change through uncreated network for specific issues and success in terms of our fight.
The courage to join up with a big media broadcaster in this sense drove level of change that you just wouldn't have been able to do yourself.
He gives me a hard time.
He gives you a hard time. But there we go, right? I mean, you both are experts in your own field, and it's about giving the conversation that gives you both what you need at the end of the day. Other questions or comments? Oren, yes, also somebody who's gone, over to you. Leads a fantastic organisation which uses networks very innovatively.
Yeah, first of all, I want to answer a bit about just what you're saying, and saying that on top of kind of, having a cause to bring people around and build a network, you have to have the right information to be able to do it. Yeah. I guess one of the debate between all the networks that you are building, is about what is the right information. Because without it, we cannot really put the right message out there. Yeah. Speak a bit about what we are doing. I'm running a human rights organization called Vedera. We give ability to people working in the most remote and challenging areas to document what's happening to them, basically giving them cameras, mostly hidden cameras, to be able to document what's happening. We verify the information and make sure it's getting to a place that can create a change. So building networks sometimes for us is around an issue, and a lot of time our networks don't know that they are part of a network. Right. So we can work with few organizations, a few people that are working around different areas, militia-based intimidations, using of food to gain political power, and people are filming and getting information, and we're building into stories, and they're all contributing for a network, and the story is out there without them knowing that they are part of a network. So this is one approach that we're using to build networks and work around with networks. And then whenever doing a project, we're looking at what's the effect will be, how we create a positive change, because change is something that is very, very hard to measure. And sometimes it's about suing people in court, sometimes it's about public opinion and putting stuff in the media. Sometimes it's about social change on the ground, because if you're working around, for example, FGM in Kenya, cutting of girls, it's illegal. People are not allowed to do it, but it's still happening. And without changing the structure on the ground and creating social change with network of people, of activists working on the location, you will not be able to achieve the change you want to achieve. So kind of, first of all, understanding very well what change look like will help you to build a good network. Good information that people agree on and really to take a step to change the situation. So this is kind of my conclusion about, you know, networking. It's a hard job. And
it's a hard job. I think anyone who does it agrees that it's a hard job. I mean, what you do, I think the model that Oren works with is interesting because it's you have different kinds of networks that you aggregate, but as you say, you keep separate from each other. So there's a kind of community network that provides the information that's then documented, but you then network out to get that information to positions of power to kind of change things as a result of it.
It's also a very fluid and changeable network, because sometimes you have platform people that supply information on one issue, they have the ability to supply other information. So you're kind of forming and changing networks all the time according to the cause of what you want to achieve.
Yeah, yeah. Question here, and then, or a comment, and then Nicola.
Yeah, I have a question. We came here to listen to 21st century approaches for social change, but I'm not sure if the question has been answered or the title has been served, because we have not heard 21st century approaches so far of social changes. If you were to answer my question, what would be the highlights? Yeah. What would be the advice? What are the main points for inserting social change and introducing the approaches that we were promised to be told about?
So a frank and confronting question, and I will answer it as I would.
No, sorry for being frank.
No, it's fine. It's good.
I come from Palestine. You spoke about the conflict in Syria.
Yes.
There was a talk about the Philippines. We listened to fisheries. It's all fine, you know, but at the end of the day, what if there is no CNN to team up with? How will you introduce change? And what are the powerful messages that I can take back home to my people so 21st century approaches will indeed be introduced for social change? So
I'm not going to lie to you. I don't think there's any golden bullets here. Okay. So the one thing I would say is that a new century does not obviate or clean a blank slate from history. We all know that. It's an iterative process of learning, and it's about spotting patterns that are emerging and capturing them for those of us that want to do some good in the world. Now, for me, that means that some of the new things that I think have not been there for very long, actually, is a willingness, and it's a new breed of humility that even the strongest titans in the world know that they can't do this alone. Like, we hear that from the world's most powerful governments. We've heard it from a global media titan like CNN. We've heard it from billionaires who've come together to fight modern day slavery. Nobody now is looking at some of the problems that we've got to face and thinking that they can do it alone. So working out how to collaborate effectively, this I really genuinely believe is going to be part of what enables us to tackle problems that are more complex and more global and more integrated in a way that we haven't done before. And there are certain facets that enable us to do that. One is that I think you're seeing more organisational models, you've heard some of them today, that are genuinely based on not the promotion of any one ideology or any one individual or any one organisation, but it's subverting that to something that is truly about collective action. And in the past that might have been community organising and unions, but it's taking a different shape today. And the third is the technology that enables that kind of organisation to be spread in a way that, you know, reaches 250 million people rather than 25 and 25. But it's that mixture and it's that alchemy. And I think all of us have a responsibility, as you say, to think about how we do that reinvention, because nobody's going to come to us with a golden bullet and say, here's your spaceship for the 21st century, this is going to solve Palestine. I wish it would, but it's not going to happen. So that's, I think, you know, the importance of sharing and learning from the iteration of some of these models that genuinely are bringing something new to the fore. You know, this is by CNN mixing with global philanthropists, mixing with, we're going to see an attempt to combat something like modern day slavery with amazing organisations like CEDIA that haven't been done before. The way that Rupert's organisation is working to look at something as massive as sustainable fisheries. This is an audacious, bold thing, and it hasn't been done in this way before. And I think, yes, you know, these are organisations that need to continue reinventing themselves, but they're sowing the seeds of something new. We need to recognise it, embrace it, is my pitch for it. Nicola? But is there anything else that Any comeback or any thoughts from that?
You're asking?
Yeah.
No, I want to say that you've answered the question. I wish you started the introduction with the remarks you just made, because I was looking throughout. I didn't want to be offending you in any way.
No,
I just wanted to be, because it's the world of democracy now, and everybody talks about democracy. And it's sad that we all come in fancy suits and we attend such fancy meetings to talk about world problems.
Yeah.
But when we go out, it's a totally different reality. And humanity is basically taken by the emergence of new technologies, whereby we are faced with a different phase of problems that we have to encounter, such as social problems to do with people impotence to deal with the emerging technologies and how to utilize them. And yet organizations like the organizations we heard about today don't, even in the literature it says the use of technology, but I hardly heard you talk about the use of technology and how that is really breaking new grounds and how such organizations are benefiting from. So I think the debate continues, and we ought to learn more and more from others' experiences.
And there's others, there's a lot of technology. I urge you to go and look at some of the projects that have been cited where the use of technology is really, really innovative in terms of the way in which technologies, not just online, but also the way in which people can physically engage, the way that it's going on to mobile, etc., are being used to build those kind of movements. So I'm sorry if it wasn't all completely answered, but I hope particularly you come from one of the places in the world where collective effort is going to be needed for probably the longest amount of time. So it's a fair question and rightly asked. Nicola, you were going to ask something then, or say you weren't going to ask something, you were going to say something, and then for Nick.
Actually, I was waving my pen around in an excessively gesticulatory way, so it serves me right. But just a couple of things, unsurprisingly, because I get the privilege of working with GEMMA at Crisis Action. And actually, to your question, one of the things that we ask ourselves to start out with is understand the nature of the problem of why change doesn't happen. And this is a question that we pick up from another very brilliant woman called Kirsty McNeil, who was the communications advisor for Gordon Brown. And if you look at why change doesn't happen, it starts to help you think about what is the nature of the solution you want to bring. So if it is because there's political competition, that there are other things on decision makers' minds, how do you put your issue up to the top of the agenda? If it's because there are vested interests, how do you expose those vested interests? If it's because you don't have enough players with you or there's not political reward, how do you create political reward? How do you make there be an incentive for politicians to do what they need to do? Is it because your solution is wrong? So people don't believe what you are saying is the right answer? In which case, do your research to show what the issue is. And by diagnosing those different things, if you are too small, if you just don't weigh heavily enough in the political calculations, get with who is big, so you get bigger. And that frame starts to pick up on these things that have come here. Oren is saying, let's have the facts, because people don't know. Amazing thing about migration, we had the privilege yesterday of talking with people who are working on migration here at Oxford University, who were passionate because they think it's the most fact-free zone of public policy that they see. Because the actual story that they are telling from multi-year, multi-country studies around migration is that migrants are either economically neutral or positive for most countries that you study. And yet that's not the story. And that's not getting out there. Second thing we've heard all the way through the last few days, storytelling. That people don't know those facts aren't being taken from the amazing academics and then told in a story that compel. They don't necessarily get the distribution networks of CNN telling the story that's out there. Something we know from our Syria work. How do you turn the story from being about refugees, regime and rebels to people like you and me, of Syrians who are doing heroic things like getting their kids to school, educating, getting water, that reframing. And then I think the thing that's really again speaks very much to the Skoll story and Crisis Action story and the privilege of being here. And the question about Palestine is I do genuinely think we're in a situation about our dream teams. If you think about your analysis of what the problem is, who do you need on your team to be part of the solution? And what is really exciting is we're now looking at places where it is around there will be allies in government at times. There will be allies in academia. There will be allies in the creative arts. There will be allies in civil society. There will be allies of those in the market. And that we are looking at ways of harnessing those different players who can work together, insider strategies where you will collaborate with governments, and outsider strategies where you will shout from the rooftops to say what you are doing is wrong. And that is incredibly exciting. And I think that is genuinely something that is, on the one hand, there's nothing new under the sun. To Gemma's point, the 21st century is not, on the one hand, so fundamentally different from the 20th because we're human beings. And yet there are these possibilities of silos are getting broken down. There is muscle memory of new collaborations. There is technology that is enabling us to do new things. And the very old-fashioned stuff of how we just connect and aggregate and use political systems to change the rewards and the calculations of who is seen to be powerful and what is seen to be important. And that, again, to speak to this is the privilege of being in this room, because each of us, and the privilege of crisis action for us, is we get to work with the world's best and most creative and most interesting to forge those dream teams, because each one of us is a part of the magic, and our challenge is to capture it.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to wrap up. The concluding remark that I had, did you have something you wanted to end with? Because you,
I just wanted to respond. I thought that was a very good question on what is 21st century about this. And I would ask us to think that NGOs are very much 21st century. We live with them and we forget it. But how many NGOs outside the big humanitarian and foundations existed more than 15 years ago? And we live in a world of tremendously empowered NGOs. And technology is a tool, but not necessarily the solution. It's the use of technology by NGOs that I think can be very, very powerful.
Yeah, thank you, Nick.
But conflict has tripled in the world. So
Not since
and countries were broken. And countries have demolished their walls, others are building walls. So.
Go on, Celia, last
word. Well, in my observation and my 20 years in development work, I think what really changed in terms of landscape in networking and collaboration is that there's so much online social media going on. And the youth, who is actually very much engaged now in terms of networking and collaboration. I think the code that we need to crack, and the challenge that we need to face is how to bring this online, phenomenon now into a more grassroots power, grassroots action. It's really to sustain, because online can be a very tactical, and it's needed, but we are aiming here when we talk about networking and social change is really long-term change and sustainability. And I think online activism doesn't very much ensure sustainability. So I would say that it should go parallel, hand in hand, that we have this online, activism, at the same time grassroots and action-based to ensure actions and sustainability for assurance of social justice. I think that's 21st century approach.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that's right. I think it's all about the hybrid. It's about understanding what's worked in the past, fusing it with what's exciting and new about the future, and recognizing, I think what you've heard from everyone that has tried to do this is it's deeply painful. You're working with organizations who have very different organizational as well as individual personalities, but it's worth the persistence. You are able to unlock a level of scale and change and impact which enables you to do something that far, far exceeds what you'd be able to do in your wildest dreams alone. So try it and experiment with it and tell us when you've got it better. Thank you very much.